There is a certain look that appears in a child's eyes just before resistance surfaces. It is not anger, it is not malice, it is something quieter, a hesitation wrapped in tension, a moment where the world feels slightly unsafe, and the child must decide how to protect themselves. Adults often see refusal. They see crossed arms, unanswered instructions, rules pushed aside like they never mattered. They label it as stubbornness, as attitude, as a problem that needs correction. But beneath the behavior, something far more human is unfolding. Children who resist rules are rarely trying to cause disruption. They are responding to an internal experience that feels overwhelming, confusing, or threatening. Resistance becomes their language when words feel insufficient. It is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is self-preservation, wearing a misunderstood costume. Every boundary feels like a question to them. Every rule quietly asks, will this keep me safe or take something from me? And when the answer is uncertain, the nervous system speaks first. Some children comply easily. They move through expectations like water, adapting without visible strain. Others feel the weight of every instruction as if it presses against something fragile inside. For these children, rules do not feel neutral, they feel personal. To understand why, one must step away from the behavior and toward the history. A child's relationship with boundaries is formed long before they can articulate it. It begins in moments that seem insignificant to adults, moments of being interrupted mid-emotion, moments of being told to calm down instead of being understood, moments where compliance was praised, but authenticity was quietly discouraged. For some children, boundaries arrive without explanation. They feel sudden, arbitrary, unpredictable, and unpredictability, to a developing nervous system, often registers as danger. Others grow up in environments where rules change depending on mood, stress, or exhaustion. What was allowed yesterday becomes forbidden today. The child learns that structure is unreliable. Trust erodes not through neglect, but through inconsistency. In these environments, resistance becomes adaptive, a way to test reality, a way to regain a sense of control when the world feels unstable. Then there are children who learned early that saying no was their only protection. Children whose boundaries were crossed too often, whose autonomy was overlooked, whose emotional signals were dismissed or overridden. For them, rules do not represent safety. They represent intrusion. So when a boundary is set, the body remembers before the mind does. Muscles tighten. Breath shortens. The instinct to push back rises without conscious thought. This is not defiance. It is memory encoded in the nervous system. Developmental psychology shows that autonomy is not a luxury for children. It is a biological need. When children feel powerless too often, they seek power wherever they can find it. Sometimes that power appears as refusal. The refusal itself becomes grounding, predictable, reliable. A small island of control in an unpredictable emotional sea. Adults often escalate in response. They tighten rules. They increase consequences. They speak louder, firmer, sharper. But escalation rarely answers the original fear. It only confirms it. A child who resists rules is often asking a silent question. Will you still see me if I don't comply? When boundaries are enforced without emotional attunement, the child hears something else entirely. You are only acceptable when you obey. This is where resistance deepens. Over time, the child begins to identify with the role, the difficult one, the strong-willed one, the one who never listens. Labels settle quietly into identity. And identity, once formed, resists change even more fiercely. Yet beneath every act of resistance lies a nervous system attempting to regulate itself, a system shaped by early experiences of safety, unpredictability, or emotional neglect. A system that learned, often wisely, that compliance did not always lead to protection. This is why some children break rules even when they understand them, why consequences fail to deter behavior, why punishment feels ineffective, or even inflammatory. The behavior is not about the rule. It never was. It is about what the rule represents: loss of autonomy, loss of voice, loss of safety. In quiet moments, these children often reveal remarkable sensitivity, deep emotional awareness, strong internal values, a profound need for fairness and authenticity. They are not unteachable, they are untrusting. Their resistance is not a flaw to be corrected, it is information waiting to be interpreted. And when adults begin to listen, not just to the words but to the nervous system beneath, the story changes. Not immediately, not easily, but honestly, because a child who resists rules is not rejecting structure. They are searching for a version of it that does not erase them. And that search, though disruptive on the surface, is deeply human at its core. From a psychological perspective, resistance to rules is rarely a conscious decision. It is a physiological response, shaped by how a child's brain learned to interpret authority, safety, and autonomy. At the center of this experience is the nervous system. Specifically, how it learned to respond to perceived control. When a child encounters a boundary, the brain does not analyze intent first. It scans for threat. The amygdala activates before logic has time to speak. If past experiences have linked authority with emotional discomfort, unpredictability, or loss of agency, the body reacts accordingly. This reaction can appear as refusal, argument, withdrawal, or explosive emotion. Not because the child lacks understanding, but because their system has learned that submission feels unsafe. Neuroscience shows that repeated experiences of powerlessness sensitize the stress response. The brain becomes hypervigilant. Even neutral instructions may register as pressure. Even gentle guidance may feel invasive. This is especially true for children with heightened emotional sensitivity. Their brains process stimuli more intensely. They feel nuance others overlook. Tone, facial expression, timing, all of it matters. When a rule arrives without emotional context, the child's system fills in the gaps with memory, and memory often whispers warnings louder than reality. Oppositional behavior, often misunderstood as willful defiance, is frequently rooted in this pattern. It reflects a mismatch between external expectations and internal capacity for regulation. The child is not choosing resistance, they are experiencing it. Psychological research highlights that children develop internalized rules only when they feel emotionally safe. Safety allows reflection. Reflection allows cooperation. Without safety, behavior becomes reflexive. This is why strict environments sometimes produce the most defiant children. Not because structure is harmful, but because structure without emotional attunement triggers survival responses. The inner conflict begins quietly. The child wants connection. They want approval. They want belonging. But they also want autonomy, dignity, control over their own emotional space. When rules feel absolute, the child faces an impossible choice: comply and lose the self, or resist and risk disconnection. For many children, resistance becomes the lesser threat. Psychologically, this creates cognitive dissonance. The child knows what is expected. They understand consequences. Yet something inside refuses to move. This internal stalemate is deeply distressing. It can produce shame, confusion, and self-blame. Children often internalize the idea that something is wrong with them. They hear disappointment in adult voices. They sense frustration in body language. Over time, they may stop trying to explain themselves. Silence replaces language. Behavior replaces vulnerability. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and perspective taking, is still developing. It relies on co-regulation from adults. When adults respond with control instead of connection, the child's regulatory system remains underdeveloped. The cycle reinforces itself. The child resists. The adult tightens control. The nervous system escalates. Understanding retreats. This is not a failure of discipline. It is a failure of attunement. Attachment theory offers further insight. Children form internal working models of relationships based on early interactions. If boundaries were delivered with warmth, explanation, and respect, rules feel containing. If boundaries arrived with threat, withdrawal, or emotional distance, rules feel dangerous. Some children learn that love is conditional. Others learn that their emotions overwhelm adults. Still others learn that compliance is the price of safety. Resistance, in these cases, becomes an act of psychological self-defense. Even when the environment improves, the nervous system may lag behind. The body remembers faster than trust can rebuild. This explains why some children resist rules, even in supportive homes. Past experiences live on neurologically. Healing does not occur on command. Inside these children lives a constant negotiation, a longing to relax, a fear of surrender. They may test boundaries not to break them, but to see if they will hold without harm, to see if limits can exist without erasure, to see if authority can coexist with respect. When adults interpret testing as manipulation, the opportunity for trust is lost. When testing is understood as communication, a door opens. The child's resistance softens not when they are overpowered, but when they feel seen. This does not mean the absence of boundaries. It means boundaries delivered with nervous system awareness, with predictability, with explanation, with emotional presence. Because for these children, rules are not obstacles. They are mirrors reflecting every unanswered fear. And until those fears are acknowledged, resistance will remain the language of survival. Not because the child wants to oppose, but because they have not yet learned that surrender can be safe. There is a moment, often quiet, often overlooked, when resistance begins to loosen its grip. It does not arrive through force. It does not come from stricter consequences or sharper words. It emerges when the child senses something unfamiliar. Safety without surrender. The turning point is rarely dramatic. It may look like a pause before refusal, a question instead of an outburst, a softened gaze where tension once lived. This moment is not behavioral progress. It is nervous system relief. For a child who has spent years guarding their autonomy, the realization arrives slowly. Boundaries can exist without harm. Limits do not always erase choice. Authority does not have to mean domination. This realization cannot be taught directly. It must be experienced repeatedly. Healing begins when rules are paired with relationship, when explanations replace commands, when consistency replaces unpredictability, when the child's internal state matters as much as their external behavior. From a psychological perspective, this is integration. The nervous system begins to rewire through new patterns of interaction. Threat responses soften when outcomes become predictable and emotionally safe. The brain learns through repetition, not logic. Each boundary that is held calmly, each limit that remains steady without withdrawal, each moment where the child is seen even while being redirected. Slowly, resistance loses its purpose. The child no longer needs refusal to feel real, no longer needs defiance to feel powerful. Power begins to come from trust instead of control. Importantly, this does not mean the child becomes compliant. Healthy resistance still exists. Boundaries are still questioned. Autonomy remains alive, but the quality changes. Resistance becomes dialogue. Pushback becomes communication. No transforms from a shield into a statement. Emotionally, the child begins to experience regulation from the inside. They borrow calm until they can generate it themselves. This is how self-control is built, not through suppression, but through safety. Many adults fear that understanding resistance will weaken authority. Psychology shows the opposite. Authority rooted in attunement is stronger than authority rooted in fear. Because fear creates obedience without trust. Attunement creates cooperation with dignity. As the child's nervous system settles, shame begins to dissolve. They no longer see themselves as the problem. They feel less defined by their resistance. Identity shifts quietly. I am difficult becomes I have feelings. I never listen becomes I can explain. This is not a linear process. Old patterns resurface under stress. Regression appears when emotions overwhelm capacity. But the difference now is context. Resistance is no longer misunderstood as character. It is recognized as communication. And when communication is received, it no longer needs to shout. Over time, the child internalizes boundaries, not as external control, but as internal guidance. Rules stop feeling like walls and start feeling like structure. Structure that holds without trapping. Structure that protects without silencing. This is the quiet success rarely celebrated. The child who once resisted now pauses, reflects, negotiates, not because they were broken down, but because they were built up. The poetic truth beneath all of this is simple. Children do not resist rules because they dislike order. They resist rules because they fear what order might cost them. When order arrives with compassion, it no longer threatens the self. In the end, resistance was never the enemy. It was the messenger. A signal that something needed gentleness, that something needed listening, that something inside the child needed to be protected before it could relax. And when that protection is offered consistently, resistance fades into trust, not as surrender but as choice. Because the deepest form of cooperation is not obedience, it is safety. And a child who feels safe no longer needs to fight to exist. They are already held. Resistance softens not when it is defeated, but when it is finally understood. If this reflection resonated, sit with it quietly. Let it reframe how resistance is seen, not as defiance but as communication waiting for safety.